like that. And I've gotten to the point now where I don't want to give Hallmark their due on Valentine's Day. Instead, I just write her a poem. And this one's called Only You, and this was written for Shelley on Valentine's Day this year. When I saw you, my love became simple. I desired just one, only you. A crowd gathered, I was on the spot, lonely and nervous, new guy, summer intern, a swarming room, narrowed to one, only you. I pitied those whose attention drifted, whose affections were duplicitous, whose multiple desires I fought with a singular craving, because I hungered for one, only you. And now my taste is conditioned, having sprung from a single day, when out of many one came through, and it is you, just you, only you, for me. And the story goes that I was a summer intern at her church. I was doing a youth ministry gig for a summer, and she was the president of the youth group and a senior, and she was graduating that year. And she walked into a room, and I was the new guy, and I was, surrounded by a whole bunch of people who wanted to get to know me. And she walked in, and I felt like my future and my present and my past were all colliding together. And so I wanted her to know that I remembered that moment. And it's really, 28 years later, it's still kind of like the linchpin that actually started our relationship off in that kind of a way. So that's why I wrote that poem for her. So, any thoughts on writing poetry?
Well, I think, that it's just something that you should start doing and not worry about form necessarily at the beginning. Even if you're writing paragraphs in a notebook and you call it a journal, that's a good practice in your daily life. If you read poems by famous authors and you try to imitate their style, that's a good way to begin as well. That's how most people kind of begin as poets, imitating strong father or mother poets. And I think your poem to your wife, who I work with as well at UE, she's a wonderful teacher, one of the best at UE. I think that's a good example of how poetry can be integrated in your everyday life. You don't have to be Robert Frost or even to pretend to have that. You can be whoever you are, and you can make poetry an important part of your life. Lewis Hyde, the great literary critic, says that poetry is a gift, and that it operates in a kind of gift economy, and it does what gifts do, which is to bond us together, right, in our most intimate relationships and in our most solemn moments in life. That's why poems are read at weddings and at funerals sometimes. That's why the poetry of the Bible kind of has been so integral in Western culture. Right. This is something that marks, poetry is something that can mark an occasion or a moment as different, as a kind of threshold, right? As a doorway that we pass through. Right.
And so, there is a difference between technical writing and the technicalities of writing a poem, and actually the practices that people have gone through in their life. And so, rhymes and putting together a haiku, for instance, or doing other kinds of things like that. There is a certain amount of technical skill that goes along with that. But what you're talking about is more keeping it about your life and trying to understand your life in a deeper way.
Yeah, I mean, you can if you get the further into poetry that you get, the more technical knowledge you'll necessarily just kind of imbibe, right? Just from reading, you'll learn certain fundamental. If you read Paradise Lost, you start to understand on a subconscious level what blank verse is all about. So what the rhythms of blank verse are, right? You don't need to know an I am from spondee, which are different types of poetic feet, right? Meters, part of meter, right? You don't need to know that in order to write a poem, right?
And there's a certain amount of poetry which is just when you're reading it, you just know that you like it, and it doesn't really need to be. I just like it. But I like William Carlos Williams because I like William Carlos Williams. He speaks to me, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think one there's a couple of great ideas about poetry. One is Samuel Johnson said that any definition of poetry only necessarily proves the narrowness of the definer, right?
Right.
So, and then the other thing is, of course, Emily Dickinson's famous kind of phrase that she didn't know poetry, but she can tell that a book is a book of poetry if it makes her feel so cold that no fire could warm her, or as if the top of her head had been physically taken off. So, and that's a great kind of hyperbolic way to talk about poetry, because there is something bodily in our reaction to a good poem, right?
Yeah, this morning I was listening to that podcast by the American Poetry Society, our foundation, where they were talking about, well, why do you read poetry? And one woman came on and said, I read poetry to let me know that there are people in the world who are smarter than me. And I thought that was really interesting and very funny. And but she did it because she was talking about, I need to know that there's some mystery still in this world, and there's some transcendence that I'm never ever going to get, and somehow embodied in poetry is a mystery of another person that you're kind of understanding and catching, right?
Yeah. I think also poetry is not merely the reflection of an experience, it's an experience in and of itself. So that's borrowing from Rainer Maria Rilke. Yeah. So, if you can kind of create an experience on the page that allows the reader to enter into it fully and live it and dwell in it as you would a moment, or as in you would a note from John Coltrane's horn, then that would be the ideal for a poet, to be able to dwell in the music of words on a page and in the air in an extended moment.
Yeah, one of my favorite books that Rilke wrote was Letters to a Young Poet, and I loved when he was talking to the young poet. He basically said, spend your life on experiences. Yeah, and then write about the experience that you're in, and that was his one of the pieces of advice he gave.
And he wrote that when he was very young too, which is funny. I think he was like 26 when he wrote that book, and he was writing to somebody who was like 18 or 17 or 16, I don't know.
Something about what he thought about their poetry, right?
Yeah. That's true.
Because he wasn't really a big fan of the young man's poetry. I don't think he was.
No, you're right, yeah.
But the book was better probably than the poetry that the guy offered it.
That's true.
Would you like to read us another one of your poems?
Sure, I'll end with a Binghamton poem. This is a poem that I wrote after walking around with a couple of my friends in downtown Binghamton with their daughter, Barbara, and there was a brass band playing at that pavilion on the Martin Luther King Park area there.
Right along the river.
Yeah, right by where River Reed used to be, right, and where the Triple City School of Beauty Culture used to be, which was, a beauty school in downtown Binghamton, right next to Boscov's. But all right, so this is called Words for Barbara Many Years From Now. So this is my friend's daughter, and she was 2, and she referred to horses as neighs. So, remember that once you rode not a horse on the carousel, but a neigh that bucked and whinnied into the teeth of the big wind whipping around your ears. During those days you drank water with a fork and danced to a brass band playing Just a Closer Walk with Thee. Remember that for a time you were 2 and mightier than sunlight's shimmer on ripples bum-rushing the past. Remember the sneeze of a small monkey in the zoo once made you laugh, and this was all one could hope to learn of poetry. Remember that once, before you grew up, you rode the neighs written deep in our bones.
My guest today is Dante Di Stefano, and we've been talking about poetry, why write it, why read it, and what it means. Thank you so much for being on Encounter today, Dante.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, and thank you for watching and for listening to us as we've been encountering Dante's poetry. I would encourage you to maybe write some yourself. Have a great day.